This started around 5 years ago, shortly after my youngest turned 1. I had always been sensitive, but this had started to frighten me. One night, I was getting ready to put my youngest to bed. He had fallen asleep on the couch. We kept all the bedroom doors closed at the time, as he was walking and had already brained himself on the door multiple times trying to close it. I had picked him up and asked my middle, 3-year-old at the time, to please open the door for me. As I waited for him to come into the hall, I watched as the bedroom door clicked open and swung into the room. I had frozen in shock and only snapped out of it when my middle had asked why I asked him to open a door that was already open. I had shrugged the question off at the time, telling him I was sorry. I forgot I had already opened it. No door in my house just swings open. It stays exactly where you leave it. When I told my husband, he brushed it off, saying I must have imagined it, or there was a breeze that pushed it open. The next day, I tested it. I wanted to be sure of what I saw. I left it cracked and carried my youngest back to the same area, and the door didn't move. I opened the windows, and the door still didn't move. Over the last 5 years, I've seen and heard many things happening in my house. As no one else sees or hears it, they brush me off and tell me I'm imagining things. That is, until this last week. I had given up trying to explain what I was seeing and hearing to my family, as they didn't believe me. I had gone to take a shower, and my husband was watching a movie and eating ice cream with the kids. The lights were off, because you can't have a movie night in a lit room. When my daughter came back from putting her bowl in the kitchen, she sat down next to her dad. As soon as she pulled her feet onto the couch, the lamp in the corner of the room turned on. My husband, being the skeptical man he is, thought it was my middle child. He asks if he was back behind the couch, and seconds later, he walks into the room from the kitchen. Now, this is a crank lamp. You have to really turn the dial for it to light up. I turned it off before getting into the shower, as I knew they would start the movie without me. When I left the bathroom, my husband looks at me and says, "I think you were right about the ghost." He pulled up the security camera footage, and you can clearly see the light turn on. You can hear him ask for my middle child, and see him enter the room a few seconds later. Now I feel smug that I'll no longer be called crazy, but the activity has picked up quite a bit in this last year, and has started to make me uneasy, especially since my youngest has started seeing the same figure I see in his bedroom. My dad, being Irish and wanting to live somewhere close to his childhood home, bought a house in a remote part of Northern Ireland in 2007. It's a pretty old farmhouse, 18th century, I think, and back then was completely dilapidated. I'll never forget the first time he showed it to my brother and I. He had spent the long car journey hyping it up, telling us about how incredible the location was, how spacious it was, the amazing interior, and then we arrived at what was essentially a creepy old building site. The creepy vibe not helped by the torrential rain that was still being released by the heavens that day. Still, over the years, post-renovation, I've grown to love spending time there. There's beautiful green rolling hills surrounding the property. There's a sea view, and the beach is a stone's throw away, with nobody around for miles. It's a hermit's paradise. I have always, however, felt unnerved and creeped out by it. During the first holiday I ever spent there, I was around 9 years old, I think. We were cleaning the attic and found an old photograph of a young woman, probably from around the Victorian times. My younger brother was absolutely terrified of it. I used to prank him by putting it in his bed before he went to sleep, or by rapping my knuckles against the bed frame, pretending that Bertha, as we nicknamed her, was coming for him. It was, granted, an unnerving photograph. There was a wild, vacant look in her eyes. and she was ghostly pale in complexion. A local from the neighboring glen who knew about the history of the house mentioned that there was a rumor that a young woman had been unalived by her jealous husband in the late 1850s in a house in the lower glen. So could have been our house, but also could have been one of the other houses in the area. That rumor, though, was enough to eventually make us return the picture to the attic, never to be retrieved again, even for pranks. At night, the house went from being creepy to being deeply unsettling. Bangs, footsteps, tapping, knocks sounded at all hours. My dad blamed the plumbing, the old pipes, and our imaginations. And that was what we would tell ourselves too, except that it would happen while the pipes were cold and when there was nobody else around. I remember one morning, my dad and I drove to our nearest village to pick up coffee and the newspaper. Half an hour later, we were back, to the immense relief of my brother, who was visibly shaking as he let us in. Apparently, the second he was alone and watching TV, he heard the distinct sound of heavy footsteps walking on the floor above him. Every time he paused the TV, it stopped, and when he resumed it, they resumed. He vowed to never be left alone again, and basically stopped coming to the house after that. In more recent years, I've been spending a lot more time at the house, being a lover of solitude and nature. I can't go alone, for reasons stated above, so I go with my partner, who finds it equally spooky. We both hear the unexplained sounds, the tapping and knocking at the windows, the footsteps at night. My partner is somewhat sensitive and has had paranormal encounters before. She said that the minute she stepped foot into the house, she could feel a sinister, dark energy emanating from inside. I got into the habit while we were staying there of going out on long walks in an attempt to prevent cabin fever. Whenever I returned, she would always report something eerie that had occurred when I was out. For example, once she had been hoovering the living room and had felt two hands grab her by the waist, only to spin around and find nothing or nobody there. She felt taps on her shoulder, heard my voice calling out her name when I wasn't at home, and heard the sounds of people moving around the house while she was in the shower. Then, recently, things got even scarier. We decided to go visit the house on a Halloween mini break, and the second we arrived, we both felt this hostile energy, as if we were trespassing into somebody else's house. It was worth noting that, shortly after my dad bought the house, all those years ago, he ended up having to work full-time in London, so was unable to permanently live there. There was talk of renting it out, but nothing came of it, so the house just sits there, desolate, empty for most months of the year. But perhaps it does have a full-time resident, after all. Anyway, we decided to try and shake off the feeling of unease and celebrate Halloween. We did the usual thing, got drunk on cheap wine, put scary makeup and costumes on, and watched stupid horror movies all evening. At around 11 p.m., my partner went to go get another bottle of wine from the fridge while I stayed in the living room. I suddenly heard her saying, "Oh my God," and I immediately stood up and rushed over to her. She turned to me, looking frightened, and said that she'd seen a white, swirling mist outside in the garden against the pitch-black darkness. It had vanished after a few seconds. That night, the noises and footsteps were louder than ever. A few days later, I was at the house by myself. My partner had gone away to see her family, who lived a few hours away, and would be returning later on that evening. I was sitting at the desk working downstairs in the living room, trying to ignore the growing uneasiness I was feeling. Then I started to hear, same as usual, footsteps sounding upstairs. But this time it was different. It was louder, as if a flurry of people were trampling around upstairs. I could hear the sound of bed sheets being moved, furniture being moved. It was coming from the upstairs room at the end of the house, where most of the unexplained noise originates from. The way I describe it to those I related it to was that it sounded as if people were making preparations upstairs for a visitor, except I was all alone. I was petrified and immediately phoned my partner, telling her what was happening. It was so loud that she could hear it over FaceTime. So now, for the most recent, and in my mind, most terrifying happening in the house so far. This happened less than a week ago, in the early hours of Monday morning. My partner and I had flown over for a weekend autumn break and had been due to fly home that morning. However, she suffers badly with endometriosis and had a flare-up, which meant that we ended up delaying our flight. Anyway, it was about 5:30 a.m., and we were both in bed. She was asleep, exhausted from feeling unwell, but I was wide awake and listening to upbeat music, just praying for tiredness. Suddenly, without warning, I became overcome with this intense, consuming feeling of dread. I went from feeling good to feeling completely freaked out in the space of about 10 seconds. I took my earphones out and turned the music off. From my position, I could see the door and most of the room, aside from the side of the bed. My partner was sleeping nearest to the door. I was on the other side. The room was dark, but some morning light was starting to filter into the cracks between the blinds, with the shapes of the furniture in the room being visible. I could see the cracks of light underneath the door being reflected onto the wall opposite as we left the lights on. And then I saw something, a shadow, moving back and forth underneath the door. I started to feel even more afraid, and then I heard a very loud footstep just outside the door where the shadow was coming from, and then a heavy creak of floorboards. I was, at this point, completely paralyzed with fear. Then, and I still can't believe this happened, as I type it out now, I saw a dark gray figure glide from the door across the room. It was hooded, almost Grim Reaper-esque, and I distinctly remember observing its transparency as it floated in front of the big wardrobe and around the bed to where I was lying. It was at this point that it went out of my line of vision, and, being unable to physically move, I didn't turn to see where it went. I summoned up the courage to use my right hand to shake my partner awake. She, after a good few minutes, woke up and turned the light on, becoming concerned when she saw the state I was in. Apparently, I was totally pale, shaking, and unable to speak, until she had managed to calm me down. I'm still recovering now. It was the most visceral, horrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. I think what made it so scary was the fact that I got a very sinister energy from whatever this thing was. We are now back home, and I'm not sure if I'll be back to the house for a long time. For some background, my grandma and grandfather bought a ranch home in the suburbs after moving from downtown Detroit in 1969. They were the second owners of the house, and it was built in the 1930s. My grandpa passed away in 1981 in the home. My mother has 4 older siblings who had all moved out by that time. She stayed living with my grandma until she married my dad in 1986. Nothing weird ever happened that she can recall from her childhood. My grandparents were Greek immigrants. They were devoted to orthodoxy, and there were at least 5 crosses and icons in every single room of the house. So, it always felt like I was at church when I was there. The first time I recall any odd goings-on was in the early 2000s. My grandma was in her early 80s at the time, and told my mother and I one day, "Don't tell anyone, but at night, before I go to bed, there are people in my bedroom that watch me." Immediately, my mom got concerned that this was a sign of dementia or Alzheimer's. Thankfully, it was not. We attributed it to her glaucoma, In hindsight, that makes no sense, or that she was in a dreamlike state, but not yet asleep. Didn't hear much about anything odd after that. In 2012, my parents separated, and my 3 siblings and my mother moved in with my grandma. My sister and I had our own rooms on the first floor, and my mother and brother stayed in the basement. Odd things started to happen. The motion sensor light at the bottom of the basement steps used to go on and off by itself in the middle of the night, according to my brother. The hallway linen closet would be open in the morning, even though it was shut previously. Some banging on my grandma's closet, all a bit weird, but nothing too crazy. One night, I had a few friends over, and we were drinking in the basement when my mom was out, and my brother was at my dad's. All of a sudden, we heard a loud crash from a downstairs closet, and when I opened it, the metal pole, which had 3 light jackets hanging on it, was split down the middle. It was odd, because there was nothing in the closet itself that would have fallen to make that sort of banging sound. I let it go and didn't think much of it. In March of 2015, my grandma sadly passed away at the age of 95. She passed in her bedroom. We knew she was going to go soon, and before we went to bed, my siblings, Mom and I, prayed over her. At about 2 a.m., I woke up out of sleep to someone saying, "Get up." And when I went into her room, she was gone. Maybe it was a dream, I don't know, but thinking about it freaks me out. After her death, things went haywire. One night, my sister and I were watching television in the living room, and it was probably 10:30 p.m. I went to the kitchen to get something to eat. The light from the TV was bright enough that I could easily find my way to the kitchen. I looked at the back door because I felt odd. That's really the only way I could describe it. The back door had a peephole, and the light in the backyard was automatically set to turn off at 11 p.m. Normally, you could see the light shining through the peephole, but I didn't. As I adjusted my eyes, I saw a large black shadow standing at the landing in front of the back door. I froze and turned my head and closed my eyes. When I opened them again, it was gone. Needless to say, after that, I felt extremely uncomfortable in the home. Prior to this, I had never had any real paranormal experience. I was on the phone with my mom and simultaneously pulling into the driveway of the house. We were finishing up our conversation when I looked at the front door. It was the kind of screen door that had a white bottom and then a window that would begin at the waist of a 6-foot adult. What I saw was my mom, kneeling in front of the door, so I only saw her eyes and her curly black hair peeking over the bottom of the window. As I was still on the phone with her, I said, "Mom, what are you doing? Stand up." And she told me that she wasn't home and would be there in a few minutes. Again, I froze, shut my eyes, and when I opened them, the eyes and curly black hair were gone. I told her I wasn't going into the house until she came home, and she didn't ask why. When she pulled in, I told her what I saw, and she said, "Honey, I was hoping none of you would see her." She went on to explain that since Grandma passed, a small girl with black curly hair and a red dress would often appear in her bedroom downstairs. She gave one specific example. She was watching TV on her laptop late at night, looked up, and saw her standing in the middle of the room with a big smile on her face. All my mom said was hello, looked back at the TV, and then she was gone. I guess this was their typical interaction. Things like the cellar door would be open. I would latch it, come back down to retrieve my laundry, and it would be open again. The banging on the closet doors got worse. The microwave door and the oven drawer would be left open. If we called my mom's phone, it would often sound like static, gurgling, if she was in the house. The worst of it happened one night, about 2 weeks before we were to move out of the house. We sold it roughly 5 minutes after my grandma died. My siblings, mother and I, were sitting in the dining room, laughing and having a couple of drinks. Without saying a word to each other, we all went silent. The air in the room got heavy, and it felt like the oxygen was sucked out of it. All of a sudden, we heard an ungodly wailing from the basement. The only way I can describe it is a mountain lion yelling. This was accompanied by stomping up and down the stairs. I hid under the table with my ears covered, and my sister sat still. My little brother cried, and my mom, the absolute badass she is, ran down the stairs and screamed, "In the name of Jesus Christ, get the fuck out of my house." We were all absolutely fucking terrified, beyond terrified. That night, we all slept in my room together. My mom and brother slept in the living room until we moved out. Nothing too crazy happened after that night in the 2 remaining weeks we lived there. It's been 8 years since, and we occasionally talk about it. My mom's siblings don't believe it because they never had any strange goings-on in the time that they lived there. I sometimes wonder if the new residents have had anything happen. They haven't sold the house yet, at least. Since then, my family has not experienced any type of paranormal goings-on. But goddamn, I don't want to live in a haunted house again. Hi friends, I hope you're staying safe. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It would really mean a lot to me. Thank you for listening. Sweet dreams.